In terms of this session, the session, because of the CREO group on Guild, is primarily for event owners. However, to be honest, the model can be used equally across a multitude of different industries, from publishing to media to research businesses. It's just that I'm taking today's session, focusing it on organizations that are coming from an events background. In terms of what we're covering, it's an introduction to the topic. We've got some principles as to how you actually build a 365 model. We're going to go through a case study as part of this and a Q&A. What it isn't is as a kind of a deep explanation for how to build these models, because there's so much that could be covered in this topic. Obviously, if it's something that appeals, we can try and have a look at doing other sessions just to go into some of the more detail about the areas. Very quick background in terms of from my side. I unfortunately, as you can see by the white hair, have had 25 years of working, never with a proper job, always as a consultant across multiple different industries. That's given me a really brilliant insight into how digital transformation has fundamentally changed everything from retail to media, telecommunications, and financial services over the last 2 decades. The last 5 or 6 years, I've been heavily involved, particularly in the events side, where the business I founded was acquired by Freeman, which is one of the big logistics business in the space. And so I've been looking a lot at how events work over that period of time. What we're doing now is basically working in a business called BBV, where actually the whole focus of what we do is on looking at helping startups and scale businesses and larger organizations accelerate the creation of communities based on this kind of model. Why you? So if I start the actual process by thinking about, I'm assuming there are people in the room who are actually from an events background asking the question, how do we move to a 365 model? The events is a brilliant place. It's having been now and looked at both associations, event organizers across different parts of the world. The one thing that seems to come out very, very regularly is that actually, as a business, you've got some great assets. Number one, you have access quite often to many of the key players, both on the buy side and on the sell side. So you've got basically essentially a black book that is a brilliant opportunity to actually use in different ways. Often you're seen as the independent third party. You've not necessarily got an axe to grind, and so it's not as if you're seen as a competitor in many of the industries in which you serve as events organizers. You potentially have the ability to really understand what's going on in the industry in terms of the latest trends, key themes, the risks, the issues, the challenges, and the opportunities of the industry. And also, because of that status, what I've seen in quite a few situations is you've got brand permission to actually potentially go into other areas that other organizations in the space may not have the similar kind of a reason to go for. So the reason why, when I was thinking about this particular piece, about why events is quite interesting, I was thinking, well, actually, it's a good starting point to actually think about what a 365 model could actually look for. There's a little bit of a why now. Obviously, I think it's, having worked in financial services and central and local government, this is a brilliant industry to work in comparison to many other. Obviously, it's not infallible, as shown by COVID and the pains of the last 2 years. I think one of the things I do find interesting about it is the fact that actually it does feel, and I don't mean to be rude about that towards the industry, but it does feel like the industry is similar to retail as it was in 2000, 2003, in the sense of very much focused on the live environment. Digital is something that is fairly immature still, even after COVID. And I think one of the key things with it is the fact that actually it's such a great industry, it's a lot of cash, that actually do you need to do more? And so as a result of that, what I do see quite often is, depending on if it's 3, 4, or 5 day events that you actually run as an organizer, what you tend to end up with in many situations is a fairly transactional relationship with the people that you deal with. There are a lot of opportunities that you could actually do based on some of the lessons learned from other industries. And that's what's formed the basis of this 365 model I'm going to talk about today. I think one of the things I'm finding, though, is actually with COVID now retreating in many parts of the world, there is a potential risk that people just go back to the old ways of working, when I think actually it would be a complete shame to do that, because actually there's now been enough interest in looking at digital channels to actually realize that there's something more to what you can do other than the actual events themselves. So in terms of what it is, what I'm talking about here is a new business model. It's a business model that will allow you to actually touch your customers year round. And what I mean by that is, if you think about the nature of events and this build up to the events, a lot of excitement, a lot of opportunity, and then after the event, it kind of gets dead. The realization I had when talking with a lot of businesses that when you try and talk about actually having a year-round relationship, actually it's very, very tactical in the way in which things are being done at this moment in time. And so this model is aimed at trying to actually build a much stronger relationship with those customers. Part of the model also is that the events act as only one of a number of different interactions that help you drive both relationships with your customers, build new relationships with customers, and actually drive revenues for the business. It's a key part to this, and I'm going to come back to this sentence later on. We need to ban the word attendees and exhibitors as part and parcel of this process, because there is so much more you can do and such a much wider audience you can reach by going down this process. But I also, coming back to some of the attributes of events, I think events are actually in quite a unique place to allow you to build on what you already have and what you're great at. The one thing I would say, though, is do not confuse a 365-day model with how do I extend my event? How do I do the event X.0? How do I get digital hybrid? And how do I stick some assets on a website and hope? This is a very different approach to that. And so what I'm not trying to do is suggest that we're going to actually recreate the events model. What I'm actually suggesting to you with this is that you use the events model as a springboard to being able to build a wider business. Now, it sounds a little bit confusing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through some steps on how you actually look at and build out a model like this. There's 4 main steps. Really, it's about starting with understanding actually what the overall universe is that you're dealing with. Number 1. Number 2, then, turning yourself into an insights business. Number 3, looking at how you can then interact with that universe and the lessons you've learned in order to actually help them solve their problems. And then number 4 is just being practical about it. Once I know that I can actually start to do different things, we don't have to take on the world. We don't have to be greedy, but we can actually test and trial some new ways of actually dealing with existing new customers. So taking each one in turn, like I said to you, I think one of the things we need to do is start by banning the words attendee and exhibitor, because you've got to think bigger than that. As an event organizer, you're very, very good. There's feedback, I think, on the line at the moment. Is it possible to go on mute for whoever's? Thank you. So if you think about an event and you think about the different types of groups, networks, and communities that actually you deal with in an event, you have all these various little, you start with a crowd of people, but that crowd of people is split into a variety of different groups. And within those groups, you have people who have particular interests around communities or networks. The thing with an event, though, is that number 1, it tends to be wall bound. So a lot of the people who actually are interested in some of the communities and networks that you're dealing with actually will only ever go to the event sporadically or sometimes not at all. And so when you're thinking about actually who's involved in some of these communities and groups, you've got to think about actually an audience that doesn't necessarily always touch the event you have. Secondly, a lot of the events are interest bound. And what I mean by that is that quite a few groups and networks within your particular industry exist and are probably very valuable, but don't necessarily think the event is the right forum for them to go to. However, they'll probably be interacting with people who actually go to the event. I think the biggest thing, though, is the fact that actually events are time bound. People don't stop after the 3 days of the event. They've got 362 other days a year where they actually interact with each other. And so you need to be actually thinking about these ideas of actually who's attending because of the boundary of the walls, who's attending because actually they're not interested in the events, and what do they do outside of those three events. And that's really where you actually start to map what we call a universe of people in that industry. And what you tend to find is that, and I'm doing this at the moment, for example, with a business in the agricultural space, where the event is focused around machinery in agriculture, but actually the people who they could touch have so many different interests above and beyond the machinery side, from understanding how to run their farms through to issues due to COVID because of fertilizer prices through to succession planning. Once you start to realize all these different people, what you realize is that the event is touching one part of your universe. But coming back to the same statement, because of the brand you have and some of the contacts you have, you're able to actually start understanding who those other people are. It doesn't have to be a difficult task. Most of the times when I'm working with companies on this, you can actually build a really good map of the universe within a couple of days or a week. But what it does is allow you to actually see where there's other opportunities. So I built a map and I've understood exactly kind of who's involved in what. The second thing is to turn yourself into an insights business. And that's nothing more difficult than just stopping asking the question, what do you think about the event? Is the event good? Is the event bad? What else can we do with the event? And just start to ask the single question, what keeps you awake at night? Because once you start asking that question and once you start getting to speak to people about those kind of areas, what you tend to find is that people actually start to open up about all manner of different topics, whether or not that's insight and knowledge, whether or not that's about more the business areas about leadership or partnership, whether it's about personal and professional issues of training accreditation, or whether or not actually, in a business areas where you sometimes need external support. And the fascinating thing about this is that every time we've gone through the process of starting to talk about people like this, some of those topics surface really, really quickly. And you start to realize how actually you can start to influence some of those groups. So like I said, number one, you start to look at who is in the universe, not just who attends the events. Number two, just start asking the question, what keeps you awake at night? The question then turns into, well, what do you do about it? Now, what you're looking at the moment, we lovingly call the Kraken. The Kraken is essentially an 8-legged beast that is based on the types of interactions that, having spent the last 3 years looking at and doing research on, these are the main areas of interaction that most businesses have with their customers. Taking each one in turn, and again, these are very, very kind of basic statements about, as you'd expect, training and accreditation. You can, when you're looking at training accreditation courses, you can do anything from basic webinars through to custom built training programs where you may get certification at the end of it. It's not something that necessarily has to be incredibly difficult. I was working with somebody called Ian Golding in 2015, who actually set up a customer experience accreditation, the CCXP, and has, over the last 8 years, globally trained thousands of people on how to become customer experience qualified experts. Now, that's an industry which didn't have a qualification before. There are probably, I would say, 20 to 30 case studies I could identify. Some of the people on the call I know have done this kind of thing before. But actually, training accreditation is a very useful area where you can actually do a lot of things around learning. One of the areas where I think a lot of people try and fail really badly, and I've seen this with companies such as Informer and Clarion, where they think that what they need to do to build a relationship year-round is create a massive amount of content and become a publisher. Now, you can do that, but actually it's incredibly hard. There are a lot of other ways in which you can start to actually produce content on a regular basis that either can be generated by partners or generated by users. That doesn't necessarily need to have your particular skills in editorial on there. But one of the things I found quite interesting is, and there's a really good example with Media 10 in the UK at the moment, where they're using an AI tool called Caboodle in order to actually build newsletters that's based around learning about particular groups of users and then setting up an AI tool to go and find the most recent and relevant news reports and news articles for those users. Media 10 has been so successful at using this tool for specific groups within their universes that actually they've now launched a new business called Blah Blah Media, specifically to try and actually monetize this ability to create content marketing through automated tools. Really interesting area to look at. Like I said, most people think of, I need to have a group of 10 or 12 editors in. Actually, you don't need to at all. Marketplaces, again, absolutely fascinating area. Traditionally, that has been an area that's been more on the B2C side, such as the Amazons, the eBays of the world, because in the business world, you generally have quite a high price in terms of the things you're buying, and it's quite a complex way to buy those things. Now, this is changing a lot. There's a lot of tools coming onto the marketplace that allow you to do some far more creative and intelligent processes for doing B2B marketplaces, where it's not just about buyer meets seller, but it's actually going through the whole process of actually getting buyers to go through and purchase things. I know that, for example, Reed and Clarion Reed particularly has been doing quite a lot of work in this space. One thing, if you're looking at that as a kind of an example, is check out the CPHI, which is the pharmaceuticals event, and see what they've done in terms of building marketplaces around chemical pharma ingredients. I think their marketplace now has something like 500,000 different products on it that they're using as a way to actually interact with people year round. Events, as you know, obviously, there's whole different types of events. I'm not going to spend much time on that. I think the key thing that you need to think about with events, though, is if I'm suddenly launching marketplaces or training services or research services, how I can actually do specific events that are bespoke to different groups. And I'll come on to that with a case study. Information services. Now, there's a lot of companies who make a lot of money by just simply aggregating data. I was working with Fast Markets before Christmas. Fast Markets made its money by being able to phone essentially metal mining organizations and find out how much they were charging for the price of metals after they were being mined. Aggregating data on nickel or copper, etc., actually is a very valuable tool, just because it's quite difficult to get that information. What I think is more interesting, though, is if you can actually start aggregating data and turning it into insights. So Barber is a really good example with IFSEC, which is an informer show focused around physical security, where they have a tool that is a subscription model where, as a facilities manager in a business, every time the government changes the laws and regulations, Barber will send me a bespoke report about what I need to do to the facilities in my buildings in order to actually make the changes required by law. And that's a multi-million-pound business that they have off the back of it. That's quite a difficult area to get into, but for those businesses that do get into that area, there's some brilliant opportunities in that space. So if I just go on research and insights, again, lots of organizations look at research and insights. Working with a business in the agricultural world that actually does specifically look at interviewing and phoning 20,000 farmers every year, and makes a fantastic business out of doing benchmarking reports and also doing bespoke consulting off the back of that. One of the things you need to think about as an events organizer is the fact that actually, because you have that trusted partner position in the marketplace, you're not seen as a competitor to many of the big players. Your ability to actually start gathering some of that data and actually using it in order to provide reports is quite interesting. Professional services is one that quite often people don't tend to think about, because it's not seen. I don't see myself as an event organizer becoming a consultant or becoming or doing work in the accountancy space. But actually, there's quite a few cases of that. Working over in the US with brand licensing, what I tended to find with that was that actually, in order to become an exhibitor, they needed to go through almost 2 years of coaching and mentoring in order to understand how, as a manufacturer of baked beans, I could get Disney to pay me to put the next Frozen characters on the side of that tin. Similarly, Cannes Lions actually has a consulting service as part of its awards program in order to help companies understand what has been best practice previously for adverts that have won awards and how can they do that. So I wouldn't discount professional services as a way to generate opportunities. And then the final one's obviously commerce. I mean, retail and e-commerce, again, is a very well-known space. You tend to find, though, that's what's quite interesting about this moving forward, is the fact that there's quite a lot of work, particularly around social commerce and community commerce, that is also driving. Now, what I'm trying to say with this is that if I start with an event and I start within a particular industry, understanding the fact that actually there are people outside my attendees and exhibitors that I can deal with becomes very valuable. Understanding what keeps them awake then allows me to then identify, is it marketplaces? Is it content? Is it learning? Is it research and insight? Or is it commerce or professional services? But your ability to actually start then testing and trialing some of those services becomes where you turn it from being an event that you have a 3-day transaction relationship with into something that actually you can build across the whole of the year. Now, some people look at that and think, oh my God, this is so expensive. It doesn't have to be. I've seen many cases where organizations have had a test and learn approach in terms of going out and trialing new offers for businesses and actually working. And for example, research and insight, quite often what I see with companies is that they'll find a third-party research provider for the first 6 to 12 months, prove the concept, and then bring those skills in-house. For things like marketplaces and e-learning, there's obviously lots of platforms out in the marketplace for you to test and trial. The question then becomes just how and who and where and when you're going to be using them. I think the other thing that is also really important to note with this, though, is that when you talk about trying to move from being an events business to being a business that's a 365-day-a-year model, you don't have to do more than one or two things. You know, in most of the cases that we've found, when we've looked at the kind of mapping of the ecosystem and when we've looked at what the kind of the problems are that keep people awake, actually it becomes quite apparent quite quickly where the value is and where you should start building, whether or not that's a research and insights capability and a training accreditation, or whether or not that's moving down the content marketing route and providing some consulting skills or advisory skills, or whether or not it's some other kind of model. It also, as per the last example, doesn't need to always be, I've got to change my model to incorporate other things. The commerce part in that third example was just simply a small amount of commerce that was just driven off the back of doing some research and insight. So what I'm trying to say is that when you're thinking through the 4 steps, learn what your market is, understand what the problems are, identify where the opportunities are, and then go out and test them. A lot of this then turns into a kind of an evolving organization that allows you to actually build out. Now, the final part of this is, and again, if you imagine that, we've gone through a lot here, but probably the easiest way to actually bring this to life is to talk through a case study. So I'm going to talk through Procurement Leaders. Now, Procurement Leaders was started by a group of people, including Alex Martinez in 2004, initially, I think, as a software business. But what they ended up doing was realizing that there was a big opportunity if you could actually start looking at business communities. And so they ended up moving into creating a magazine for procurement leaders. Very, very boring, I would say, space in many many examples. But a fascinating space, because what was happening after the .com was a lot of businesses that were becoming more international in nature were realizing that how they buy services into their own business is quite strategic. And so this procurement role was actually moving into a board role as opposed to being something that was just under the finance team. And so Alex and the team realized that actually if they could start building this magazine, what they're able to do was actually attract a very, very niche business community that they could deal with. Now, what they ended up doing was spending a lot of time during that early years building up the insights around actually what drives the community. So they ended up working with a lot of different people to actually build that brand and get people to actually interact with them, to tell them what kind of things they would be keen to see. And one of the first areas of that was actually a realization that what they should be targeting on was the top executives within the procurement field, because those are the ones that had the budget, that were keen to actually learn about best practice and understand what was going on. And so they ended up, as a result of that, moving from a magazine publisher to a magazine and events business. Part of the reason for that was because a lot of the procurement people were coming into a role where there wasn't really anybody who was training and mentoring them, and they were not really up to speed with what the art of the possible was in the world. So they were keen to talk to people to understand what the issues were. They were keen to get some form of training and education, and so the events side started and actually built into a fascinating area of their business that helped them grow quite significantly. What happened then, though, was that over time, as they realized that the publishing and the event side were providing the insight, what they saw was an opportunity to actually move towards more of a subscription model, because what they realized was they were gathering so much knowledge and data on the industry that they were actually able to do a research and insights business as part and parcel of what they were doing. So they ended up launching a benchmarking service that over a period of a year or two actually morphed into a full research offer, because so many people were keen to know about latest technologies, about latest processes, about latest business practices, the costs associated with doing certain things according to different categories. And what they found was actually having realized that that ability to be able to actually combine all that leading edge knowledge from the content marketing and events into the research just gave them that catalyst that allowed them to actually have far more intrinsic value to a much wider group. The most important or most interesting part of it, though, was what they then realized was as they were doing the research and the benchmarking piece, was that there was high-end micro communities of the people right at the top of the industry who the benchmarking was just not relevant to, because they were leading the industry in what they were doing. So what ended up happening with that was Alex and his business partners ended up creating 2 or 3 very high-end niche micro communities that specifically dealt with the top 100, top 150 companies in the world, where they had their own bespoke events, they had their own bespoke content that was coming out in terms of seminars, white papers, and magazines, and also specific research elements that came out. Now, what you see when we go through this particular case study of what it is and how it works is the fact that, like I said, although this started as a publishing model rather than an events model, it was the ability to start understanding wider audience needs and asking that question, what keeps you awake at night, that allowed Alex to actually transition over 3 different parts of the Kraken model. Result, when they sold the business, they had 33,000 members worldwide, employed 120 people, and had offices globally. Now, we've covered a lot in a very, very short space of time, and I do appreciate that actually a lot of this theory that we're talking about at this moment is quite new to some of the people in the room. There's a lot that we could go into and a lot more detail, but I think the key thing I'm trying to highlight with this, which is very different to a lot of the conversations I have had in the last 2 years with people in the event space, is that you're not going to create a 365-day model just by extending the event. You've got to think about who is that wider audience above and beyond attendees and exhibitors. What is it that keeps them awake at night? And when you think about the concept of a Kraken, what kind of things could you do in terms of interacting with them to solve their needs? Combine all that, similar to what Alex did, and actually you do have a model that will actually provide a hell of a lot more value. And from a multiples perspective, if you're thinking about business to buy and sell, put you in a much greater position to be able to get a higher value for the business. Now, 29 minutes, 45 seconds, and I think 4 or 5 minutes of that at the beginning was talking. So I apologize for being kind of slightly over in terms of the time.
No problem. Thanks a lot, Rob. So we've got, if we finish at 4:45, we've got whatever that is, 7 minutes only. But have you got questions? There aren't any in the chat. I mean, there's various comments, Rob, that have been happening as you were speaking, but not any particular questions. You can either type them into that chat, or if you want to do the raise the hand thing, then you can just ask them as well via the video or audio. Heidi's off. So someone put their hand up there. That was Deo. Do you want to just ask it if you come off mute?
Yeah. Hi. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Hi, Ashley. Thank you for putting this together. Good to see you again.
Hi.
So, Rob, thanks so much for sharing that. Very insightful. I have a question about, or maybe if you have suggestions about what would you say are some of the best strategies or ways to identify the opportunities. So for someone who spent a lot of time on the tech side of things, I've realized that the technology and the solutions are really not the problem, but how would you go about identifying these opportunities? Because I do know and I believe they're there. But what would be some of the ways or ideas or approaches you would say to identify these potential clients, potential customers, or communities? Yeah, thanks.
So there are obviously a number of ways to do this. It depends partly if you're thinking about communities within an existing event that you might have, or whether or not you're looking for communities that are outside. What we've found when we're working with a lot of the organizations is that you're dealing with businesses where some of the businesses are old traditional, some of them are new and leading, some of them are in between. When you actually start asking them the questions, actually, what keeps you awake at night, it's really down to a lot of qualitative research, I think is the best thing to do. I've found that even talking to 15 or 20 people, once you talk to business leaders around a variety of different areas and topics, you'll find a whole host of opportunities suddenly start to arise that actually don't necessarily have anything to do with what you do at the event, but actually will drive a lot of the discussion. So one of the people on the call today is John Donoghue, who did a piece of work for me on events in the energy space. What we found with that event is that because of a lot of the COP26 style issues about sustainability, a lot of the people who were exhibiting at that trade show were either putting their heads in the sand because they did not want to worry about the fact that in 20 years' time, we're not going to have any coal power fire stations, and they were selling stuff into that. They were panicking because in 20 years' time, there's not going to be any coal power fire stations. They didn't know what to do. They were trying to work out how to transition because they had some ideas, but didn't know necessarily how to go about changing their model. Or they knew exactly what they wanted to do and actually were going out to try and promote it to the market. And when you start to talk about these people about actually, well, kind of what kind of problems they're facing, each one of those 4 groups had a different set of problems that they were trying to face. Some of those you could fix within a trade show environment, but actually quite a few of those required a totally different thought process for the kind of opportunities that you could do with people like that. So if you take that middle group, particularly the people who had no idea what to do, research and insight was a really interesting area because I knew I need to change, but I don't know what to do. So it's about research and insight. For the brand leaders, it's about content marketing. I need to get my name out there. So I want white papers. I want to be sponsoring webinars. I want to be actually putting my name in front of summits so that I can actually go out and tell you what's happening. The traditional people who just want to get leads and just continue managing, it was about marketplaces, or it was about trying to actually trade shows and actually be exhibitors in those trade shows. So when it comes to that question about how to actually start identifying the opportunities, I literally would go back to it's as simple as asking the question, what keeps you awake at night? But what you need to do is be consistent and keep talking to as many people as possible. If you can do that, then you will start to see patterns emerging as to what those different kind of groups of people are and how they work. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you very much.
It's okay.
Anyone else want to do the raise hand thing and ask a question? I've got one, if not. Lee?
Hey, I'm gonna stop just being the guy that's chatting the whole time and get on audio here. Yeah, I mean, I think about this a lot, and I think it's sort of inherently built into silos, right? That you've got the event silo, and you've got the community silo, and you've got the learning silo. It's surely not as easy as just redoing the org chart, but it does seem like there's a philosophical change in terms of how organizations function, that we're not just the event people over here don't talk to the community people. It seems like everything should be under community or something. Maybe that's a biased look, but yeah.
Absolutely. So again, the business I'm working with is exactly the situation. I have publishing, I have digital, I have events, and it's not only a case of the silos are in terms of the functions, in terms of the different divisions. The silos are also there in terms of the functions. So I've got salespeople from 3 different parts of the business selling to the same client. I've got marketing people going after the same email addresses. I've got editors who are writing content 3 times because it's going into different groups. The magic sauce is in the customer, because at the end of the day, there's a big difference between, and I'll take it from a client perspective. So BASF is a big business in the agricultural space. Rather than I'm going to ask you to do some content marketing to sponsor an insert about fertilizers, and I'm then going to get you to do a 1-page advert in the magazine, and then I'm going to get you to come and spend some cash on an exhibition for space. You have to take it back and start to say, right, BASF, what is it you're trying to achieve this year in terms of your marketing objectives? What is it you're trying to sell? Who you're trying to sell to, and how you're trying to sell? Because actually, the assets I have in terms of magazines, digital offer, content marketing solutions, and exhibitions, I can provide something that's a totally different experience for you if I understand what you're trying to achieve as an outcome. Not, do you want space on the show floor, or do you want this? And so what I'm finding with a lot of the organizations I deal with when we're going through this, the magic source is understanding how the customer flows. It's looking at what the needs are and what journeys they go on. Because if I start to think about what are their needs and how can I solve them, as opposed to here's my products and how can I sell them, that's the difference. And that's a cultural change issue, because you need to start getting all the business to start understanding who your customers are and how you're helping those customers, not how I'm selling space, how I'm selling advertising, how I'm selling content marketing. Easy. It's easy to do. To be honest, Lee, that's a whole seminar and probably a whole week of drinking and talking through that. But it's the most fascinating part.
Any other questions? By the way, it is now 4:45. So if you need to jump off, then do. But I'll maybe keep it going, maybe 5, maximum 10 minutes. Certainly keep it within the hour. But if you've got any questions you want to ask, then sort of feel free to ask them. Someone asked them how to get in contact with Rob. Did I see that? How can we keep in touch with Rob? Daya was asking. Stumped. I don't know. Pigeon.
Obviously, I'm on Guild as one of the Guild members on CREO. You can find my details through Guild and just contact me directly through direct messaging on that, and we can then follow directly from there.
Yeah. Probably even the dare I say the Voldemort LinkedIn as well. I'm sure works, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Question here from Michael.
Hi. So first of all, sorry, Rob. Sorry for joining a little bit late. Some children's duties. My question is, particularly as a continuation of your last point. Mm-hmm. What do you feel that there's a customer experience expectation for that transition from a 1 day or a 2 day or a 3 day event to this 365 event? So, do we see any similarities in what people are expecting? Are they, and second part of that question would be, I know Darius mentioned that he doesn't think there's an issue with doing that transition with the tools. My view is slightly different. Having reviewed quite a few of them, I actually don't think they're fit for purpose. So it's still in the realm of the customer experience of what people are expecting and what can be delivered.
Yeah. So let me take each part of that question in turn. So the question number one is, what have I seen in terms of how people have transitioned from a 3-day relationship to a 365 from the customer side? It depends entirely on the industry you're serving and the kind of problems they're facing. Because some industries, the concept of community is just irrelevant. They don't want to deal with it whatsoever. So what they're looking for is far more transactional support throughout the year, which might be research or benchmarking tools, or it might be looking at marketplaces where it's a buyer and seller relationship. Other organizations and other industries are very community driven. And so it's all about the touch points and being able to get people to help understand what the art of the possible is and inspiration, and getting them to actually collaborate and talk to each other. So it does, and this is why I'm saying I had a diagram where you showed 3 different versions of the Kraken in 3 different areas. That's because it is very, very specific to the needs of that particular market and the type of customers you're going after. Even in procurement, the example I gave about procurement, there's a big difference between procurement leaders and procurement managers in terms of the kind of things that I expect. Because when you're in the mid level of an industry as opposed to the top, you'll be thinking about things such as professional qualifications, training, mentoring, jobs, and those kind of areas. And so you need to think about what kind of services and what kind of touch points you have with that. So does that answer the first question in terms of the kind of the differences between transitioning from a 3-day to a 3? The second part is on the tech side. Everything I'm seeing in the marketplace at the moment is actually, it's almost tech irrelevant. It's the data side that's the key thing. Because if I can understand the data, that allows me to look at how somebody has interacted at an event versus on a website for a magazine versus how many times they've gone on and looked at a forum on a community or looked at research reports. It's to be able to understand the behaviors of those touch points, which is the key thing. And so I almost don't care what kind of e-learning system it is, or what kind of marketplace it is, or what kind of CMS I'm using for the publishing side. It's much more about the integration layer, about how that data is used, and that, to be honest, is really where some of the magic sauce comes in. Because if I can start to understand how I'm touching you, and when I'm touching you, and the frequency, and also the kind of behavioral elements of how I'm touching you, that's key. I do agree. There's no magic sauce in terms of, there's no platform out there that actually gives you everything. There's some interesting stuff coming on about kind of headless architectures, and it's going into a very technical element. But this idea of there's if you haven't seen it, a thing called the Mac Alliance, which is now looking at about how you actually get this kind of focus on the data, irrespective of what the platform is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just didn't get the last bit. Mac, you said Mac Alliance?
It's the Mac Alliance. I can, again, if you contact me directly, I'll send you a link to it. There's some really interesting theories coming out and some thinking around it at the moment for exactly this particular issue, in the sense that there's too many platforms, too many things trying to do. It's not about the platforms, it's about the data.
Okay. Yeah, no, I come from a data background, so I totally agree on the data stuff.
Thanks, Michael. So we're kind of getting near to the end of time, but if anyone is keen still finally to ask a question. No? Okay. Well, thanks everyone. It was a smallish group, but actually in many ways I find the smaller groups more enjoyable because they're a bit more kind of personal and intimate. But the tech all seemed to work, which is good. And we'll figure out if we can edit and sort of share the video. But thanks a lot for that, Rob. Great stuff for our inaugural CREO video meetup. Although look, he's got sort of a non-emoji, but very good, sparkly, shaky stuff to celebrate.
Excellent.
So yes,
well, thank you.
Yeah, and people can DM you on Guild or find you on LinkedIn, I'm sure.